The radio on Wes Okara's belt had gone silent sometime around 4 in the afternoon. He had been moving along the northeastern boundary of the conservancy when it happened, a stretch of open grassland that curled into dense acacia scrub near the dry riverbed, familiar ground that he had walked for nearly 9 years without incident. He knew where the termite mounds rose from the earth in soft, irregular hills. He knew where the soil turned loose and unreliable near the old elephant paths. He knew the particular way the light fell across this land in the late afternoon, how it turned the dry grass into something almost luminous, how it made the whole plain look ancient and unhurried and sure of itself. He had not been sure of his footing near the embankment edge. The pack had appeared perhaps 20 minutes before the fall, 12 wild dogs, maybe 14, moving fast and low through the acacia scrub along the eastern boundary. Their painted coats flickered between the trees like something half-imagined, and their high-pitched contact calls carried clearly across the warm air. Wes had slowed his pace and moved wide around them instinctively, giving the pack its distance the way every experienced ranger learns to do before any other lesson. He had been reading their movement, trying to determine whether they were actively hunting or simply relocating along a known corridor, when he stepped back to widen his angle and felt the ground vanish beneath his right foot. The fall itself was quiet. There was no warning sound, no dramatic moment of suspension, just the sudden, total absence of stable earth, and then the embankment slope rushing up beneath him, his right ankle folding hard against the uneven ground, his body rolling once before, stopping against the base of a low acacia with a force that pushed all the air from his lungs in a single sharp exhale. The radio skidded away from him across the dry earth. His vision went white at the edges, then cleared, then blurred again with the specific quality of serious pain making itself known. He lay still for a moment and let his body report. The ankle was the problem. The pain from it was immediate and total, not the sharp, bright pain of a cut or a bruise, but a deep, pressurized agony that radiated upward into his calf and told him, with clinical certainty, that something structural had given way. He pressed his palm flat against the earth and tested his weight very carefully, shifting just enough to assess. The response was unambiguous. He lowered himself back down. The savanna continued its business around him. A pair of hornbills called from the canopy overhead. Wind moved through the grass in long, slow waves that bent the stalks almost to the ground before releasing them. The light was changing in the way it always does in the Mara in the final hours of afternoon, deepening from gold to amber, casting long shadows from the acacias across the pale earth, making the whole landscape feel simultaneously vast and close. The temperature was already beginning to drop, just slightly, with the first suggestion of the cold that would arrive fully after dark. He reached for the emergency whistle clipped to his chest vest. His fingers closed around it. He did not blow it yet. He lay still first and listened, because listening had kept him safe more times in 9 years of fieldwork than any piece of equipment he had ever carried. The wild dogs were still in the scrub. He could hear them, the intermittent contact calls, the soft rustle of movement through dry brush. They had not caught his scent yet, or if they had, the wind direction was keeping them from triangulating it. He had perhaps a short window before that changed. A pack of this size, operating in fading light with an injured and grounded animal in their range, was a different equation from a pack moving through open country during the high heat of midday. He understood this without needing to articulate it. The body understands certain mathematics before the mind can arrange them into language. He blew the whistle 3 times in the pattern that the Conservancy used for distress, 3 short bursts, a pause, 3 more. The sound carried out across the plain and was absorbed by it without reply. He did not know how far the signal had traveled, or whether any other ranger was close enough to receive it. The nearest patrol post was over 6 kilometers northeast. His vehicle was parked 2 kilometers east along the track, and that distance might as well have been 20. He settled back against the acacia and measured the light that remained. 40 minutes, perhaps. Less if the cloud cover that had been building along the western horizon continued its movement inland. He had water in the canteen on his belt. He had the whistle and a small first aid kit in the chest vest. He did not have a functioning radio. He did not have the ability to walk. He had the training to be afraid without being controlled by it, which is the only kind of composure that matters in a field situation. He breathed carefully and steadily and thought through what was available to him, and it was in the middle of this quiet, deliberate accounting that he became aware of a sound behind him, or rather, the absence of one. Something was moving through the tall grass to his left. Something large. He could feel it in the faint change of air pressure, in the way the insects in the immediate vicinity had stopped their sound, in some older and less articulable sense that the body carries without ever quite being able to explain. Whatever was approaching was doing so with the particular silence of an animal that did not need noise to announce its presence, the deep, purposeful quiet of something that had decided to move toward him and was doing so on its own terms, at its own pace, with no hurry and no hesitation. Wes did not turn around. He kept his breathing even, and his hand relaxed around the whistle, and he waited, because the savannah had taught him over 9 years of close and careful attention that the worst thing a person can do when they do not yet understand what they are facing is to act before the picture is complete. The grass parted softly behind him, and the evening held. She came around the left side of the acacia without sound. Wes heard nothing before she appeared, no rustling, no branch displacement, no compression of dry grass beneath weight. One moment the space to his left was empty, and the next it was not. She was simply there, the way large cats are sometimes simply there, as if the air had arranged itself differently and produced her from its own quiet substance. She stopped approximately 4 meters away and stood without moving. Her name in the Conservancy's field records was F7, though the rangers who had worked this boundary for years had long since stopped using the designation in conversation. They called her Safi, a Swahili word meaning clean, given not with sentimentality but with the particular pragmatism of people who spend enough time with an animal that a number begins to feel insufficient. The name came from the pale, unmarked stripe along her left shoulder, a section of fur lighter than the rest of her coat, as though that one patch had been exposed to more sun than everything around it. She was approximately 7 years old, a dominant female with a known range that covered nearly 40 square kilometers of the northeastern Conservancy boundary. She had successfully raised 2 litters over the past 4 years, and the monitoring team had logged her movements across 3 full field seasons with a consistency that made her one of the most documented individuals in the entire Conservancy database. Wes had contributed more observation hours on Safi than on almost any other animal in his 9 years of ranging. He knew the particular angle at which she carried her head when she was assessing something at distance. He knew that her right ear had a small notch near the tip from a territorial encounter logged 2 seasons ago. He knew that she tended to work the northeastern scrub boundary in the late afternoon hours, moving from the dry riverbed toward the open plain as the light changed, following a corridor she had used consistently since her mother had worked the same ground before her. None of this knowledge told him what to do in the current moment. He kept still. His breathing was slow and deliberate, the kind of breathing that requires actual effort to maintain when the body is receiving information that would prefer to trigger a different response entirely. His hand remained closed around the whistle at his chest. He did not raise it. He did not speak. He watched her through lowered eyes, not the direct, held eye contact that reads as challenge to a large predator, but the soft, peripheral attention of someone trying to be present without being confrontational. She was reading him with her whole body. Her nose worked in short, careful pulls of air, processing the information his scent carried, his sweat, his fear, the particular chemical signature of injury that animals detect long before any visible sign confirms it. Her amber eyes moved across him slowly, not with urgency but with the methodical quality of a thorough assessment. Her ears tracked independently, one forward toward him and one angled back toward the scrub, monitoring both what was in front of her and what remained behind. "Easy," Wes said. The word came out barely above a whisper, not as a command and not as comfort, simply as sound, as the minimal human offering of voice that sometimes matters more than its content. Her left ear turned briefly at the sound. Otherwise, she did not react. Then the wild dogs came into the open. They had been working his scent on the shifting evening wind for some time, and the movement of the lioness through the scrub had likely accelerated their approach. Wild dogs track the reactions of other predators with the same precision they apply to everything else, and the sudden, purposeful movement of a lioness is information that demands interpretation. 3 scouts appeared first at the edge of the scrub, their painted coats distinct in the amber light, their oversized ears angled sharply forward. They moved with the quick, rolling gait of animals that have located something of interest and are measuring its implications. Behind them, at the tree line, more shapes shifted in the low shadow. They stopped when they cleared the scrub edge and found the lioness already there. The lead scout's posture changed in a way that was small but complete, a slight lowering of the head, a shortening of the forward lean that had characterized its approach. Wild dogs are intelligent and adaptive, and their group intelligence functions with a kind of distributed awareness that makes them extraordinarily effective hunters. But they are also animals that make continuous and accurate risk assessments. And what the lead scout was assessing now was not simply a lioness standing between the pack and an injured human. It was a lioness that had not charged, had not vocalized, had not made any of the aggressive displays that would have indicated an animal operating from agitation or surprise. She had simply positioned herself and gone still. That stillness was its own kind of statement. It was the posture of an animal that had made a decision and was not in the process of reconsidering it. The scouts read it the way all wild animals read that quality of stillness, as something more resolute than aggression, as something that did not require noise to be absolute. The lead dog took 2 slow steps backward. The others shifted. A low, urgent contact call moved through the group, and then they were withdrawing into the scrub, not in panic, not in full retreat, but in the careful, tactical pullback of animals that have recalculated and chosen differently. Safi watched them go without moving. Her tail swept once, low against the ground, then was still. When the last painted flank had disappeared into the tree line, she stood for a long moment facing the direction they had gone, her ears tracking the sounds of their movement through the brush. Then, without looking at Wes, she settled. Not lying down, she lowered herself into a resting crouch. Weight shifted forward onto her front legs. Head up, eyes on the open ground ahead. The posture of an animal that intended to remain exactly where it was for as long as the situation required. Wes exhaled slowly into the cooling air. He had no category for what was happening. He had the instinct to find one, the trained impulse of a man whose profession is built on careful classification and documented observation, on replacing the uncertain with the recorded, on giving shape to the shapeless through language and data and the steady accumulation of evidence. But the evidence in front of him did not resolve into a clean explanation. It resolved only into this: the light was fading, the pack had withdrawn, and the lioness had not moved. Night arrived the way it always does on the Mara, not gradually, but decisively, as though a final agreement had been reached somewhere above the clouds, and the light had simply honored it. The temperature dropped with purpose. The sky opened into a dense, uninterrupted spread of stars that had no equivalent in any place where human light competed with them, and the grass went silver in the moonlight, every blade distinct and still. From somewhere far to the south, a hyena's call rose and fell across the cooling air, that hollow, ascending sound that belongs entirely to the African night, that carries across distances in a way that makes the dark feel simultaneously larger and more intimate. The acacia above Wes shifted in a brief wind, its small leaves turning once, and then everything was still again. He had pulled himself into a slightly more protected position against the tree's base, his broken ankle extended carefully in front of him, his back against the rough bark. He had blown the whistle twice more after dark, at the intervals protocol required, angling it upward the way he had been taught to maximize carry distance across open ground. Whether it had reached anyone, he could not determine. The plane absorbed sound differently at night, some sounds traveling farther than expected, others disappearing within meters of their origin, the logic of it governed by wind and temperature and the particular density of the air in ways that no amount of experience made fully predictable. The pain in his ankle had changed character since the fall. The initial sharp, pressurized agony had settled into something duller and more continuous, a deep, rhythmic throb that pulsed with his heartbeat and was manageable only when he kept absolutely still. Any small shift of weight, any involuntary tightening of the muscle above the fracture, brought it back to full attention immediately. He had learned to move nothing below his right knee. He had learned to breathe around it. Safi had not moved far. She was approximately 6 meters to his left, facing outward toward the open plain, positioned with the alert stillness that large cats maintain when they are resting the body without releasing the attention. She had not lain on her side. She remained upright in a low crouch, her front legs extended, her head raised, her ears working independently in slow rotations that read the dark in every direction. The moonlight caught the pale stripe on her left shoulder and made it faintly luminous. Her breathing was audible in the deepest quiet, long, slow, and even the breath of an animal in full physiological control of itself. The wild dogs had retreated after her initial stand, but they had not gone far. Wes could hear them moving in the scrub to the east, the occasional contact call, brief and muted, carrying the particular quality of a pack maintaining cohesion across a resting dispersal. They were not hunting, they were waiting. A pack of this intelligence and size understood that situations changed, that the variables governing a standoff in open ground at dusk were different from those governing the same ground at midnight and different again at the cold hours before dawn. They had time, and they understood how to use it. The first test came near midnight. 3 dogs broke from the eastern scrub fast and low, covering ground at a pace that suggested coordinated intent rather than exploratory approach. Safi rose from her crouch with a sound that was not a full roar, something shorter and more compressed, a deep, resonant expulsion of air from the chest that functioned less as noise than as physical presence, as a vibration that the body received before the ears fully processed it. It moved across the ground between predator and pack like something solid. The lead dog stopped so abruptly that the 2 behind it nearly closed the gap before they corrected. She held the sound for 3 seconds. Then it stopped, and the silence that followed was of an entirely different quality than the silence that had preceded it. The dogs stood in place for a moment, long enough for the assessment to complete, short enough to preserve their options, and then withdrew back into the scrub in a tight group, their movement efficient and without panic. Safi watched the tree line for a long moment after they disappeared. Then she settled back into her crouch and did not look away from the east again. Wes had watched all of this through eyes that were becoming increasingly difficult to keep fully open. The cold was deepening with every hour, moving through his clothing with a slow, thorough patience, and his body was allocating its warmth inward toward its most essential systems in the way that bodies do when the situation demands prioritization. He was not losing consciousness exactly, it was less dramatic than that, more like the border between waking and sleep growing permeable and unreliable, so that he would be fully present for minutes at a time, and then find himself returning from some middle distance without knowing how long he had been there. In these intervals, he was consistently aware of one thing: the sound of her breathing. It was not a comforting sound in any way that could be easily articulated. It was entirely wild, the respiration of an apex predator at rest, carrying in it nothing that was meant for him, nothing offered or withheld. But it was a present sound, and in the particular arithmetic of that long, cold night, presence was the only currency that mattered. "Still here," he said quietly, at some point in the deep hours before dawn. The words were not addressed to her or to anyone. They were simply the act of a man confirming to himself that his voice still worked, that he remained continuous, that the night had not yet taken anything essential. Her right ear turned toward the sound, held for a moment, then rotated back to the east. The second approach from the pack came in the coldest part of the night, that particular darkness that arrives in the 2 hours before dawn, when the temperature has finished its descent and sits at its lowest point, and everything alive is at some level of maximum effort simply to maintain warmth. This time the dogs came from 2 directions simultaneously, a flanking movement that reflected the sophisticated group problem-solving that makes African wild dogs among the most effective hunters on the continent. The eastern approach was the obvious one, the distraction. The northern edge was where the real pressure came from. Safi moved then, in a way she had not moved before, outward rather than simply rising, placing herself at a wider angle that addressed both approaches at once, making her effective presence larger than her physical body. The sound from her chest this time was longer and lower, continuous rather than compressed, and it did not stop until the northern group had reversed its approach and rejoined the eastern scouts at the tree line, and the combined sound of their retreat had faded into the scrub and continued fading until it was indistinguishable from the general silence of the plain. She stood for a long time after they were gone, facing the tree line, reading the quiet for anything that had not fully withdrawn. Then she returned to her position at his left and settled again. The cold held. The stars continued their slow arc across the sky, A lion male, distant, somewhere north of the river, gave a full territorial sequence that rolled across the grass in long, diminishing waves, and the plain absorbed it completely, and the silence that returned afterward felt deeper than the silence that had preceded it. Wes turned his head carefully and looked at her. She was already looking at him. Her amber eyes were steady in the moonlight, neither soft nor hard, simply present, fully attentive, carrying the quality of an animal that had made no decision it was currently reconsidering. The moment lasted only a few seconds. Then she looked back toward the east, and the night continued, and the cold continued, and she did not move again until the sky began, almost imperceptibly, to change. The sky did not brighten so much as it relented, a slow, reluctant loosening of darkness along the eastern horizon that turned the black to deep blue, and the deep blue to something without a clean name, the color of the world in the moments before it decides to be visible again. Safi had shifted her position sometime in that transition. She was no longer in the low crouch she had maintained through the long hours of the night. She was sitting upright, her front legs straight beneath her, her posture carrying the full, composed attention of an animal that had registered the change in light and adjusted to it without changing anything essential about what she was doing. She was still facing outward, her ears were still working. The pale stripe on her left shoulder caught the first diluted light of pre-dawn and held it in the same faint, luminous way it had held the moonlight hours before. Wes was conscious, but only in the most functional sense of the word. He was aware of the cold, profoundly aware of it, in the way that cold becomes the primary fact of existence when the body has been managing it for hours without adequate resources. His hands were stiff. His thinking had the particular slow quality of a mind operating on reduced reserves, each thought arriving with a slight delay, as though traveling a longer route than usual to reach coherence. He knew where he was. He knew what had happened. He could track the basic sequence of the night behind him with reasonable accuracy, though the deep hours had gaps in them that he could not fully account for. He knew the search team would come with the light. That was the protocol he had helped write, and he trusted it the way he trusted most things built from accumulated field experience, not with certainty, but with the calm, reasonable confidence of a man who understood the systems he worked within. What he did not know was whether the whistle signals had carried far enough, or whether the team was working the right quadrant, or whether the particular geography of the northeastern scrub boundary had cooperated with the acoustics of the night in the way he had needed it to. He had blown the whistle once more at first, light, a single set of 3 bursts, and then conserved what remained of his energy for remaining still and warm and conscious, which were the only productive contributions available to him. The search team had been moving since well before dawn. 5 rangers in 2 vehicles, running a grid pattern outward from the coordinates where Wes's truck had been found parked and empty on the eastern track. They had the whistle signals 3 sets logged at intervals by the ranger who had been working the western boundary and caught the sound on a favorable wind shift sometime after 11. The triangulation was rough, placing the origin somewhere within a 2-kilometer radius of the northeastern scrub boundary, which was enough to focus the search without being enough to end it quickly. They had driven without headlights for the final kilometer, navigating by moonlight and by the collective knowledge of people who had spent years learning this land in every condition it offered. It was Ranger Amara Dubé who saw it first. She had been scanning the terrain ahead through the vehicle's windscreen with the particular focused patience of someone who has learned that the savannah rarely announces what it contains, that most of what matters is found at the edge of perception in the small inconsistency of shape or shadow that does not belong to what surrounds it. She saw the acacia first because it was slightly larger than the surrounding scrub and stood alone in a way that drew the eye. And then, at its base, the shape that was wrong for the ground, horizontal, slightly propped, unmistakably human in its proportions. And next to it, or rather between it and the open plain ahead, another shape, larger, still, upright. She raised one hand without speaking, and the vehicle stopped. They sat without moving for a full minute, watching. The larger shape resolved in the growing light into a lioness sitting, facing away from the vehicle, her posture unchanged from whatever it had been before their arrival. She had not turned at the sound of the engine. She had not altered her position. She remained exactly as she was, as though the vehicle's appearance was information she had received and assessed and set aside, as not currently requiring a response. Amara cut the engine. The team moved on foot, spreading into a loose arc, keeping their voices low and continuous, not calling out, but speaking to each other in the murmured, unhurried tones that experienced rangers use to announce their presence to large predators without triggering a defensive response. They kept their movements slow and their bodies angled slightly sideways, avoiding the direct forward approach that reads as challenge. They had worked around habituated lions before. The principle was always the same: make yourself known, make yourself legible, do not surprise. The lioness rose when they were approximately 35 meters away. Not in alarm, the movement was too deliberate for alarm, too composed. She rose the way an animal rises when it has been in one position for a long time and the change in circumstance is sufficient to require a new physical orientation. She took 3 steps to the left, away from the acacia and away from Wes, and stopped there in the open grass and turned to face the approaching team fully. Her tail was low. Her ears were forward. She was reading them with the same thorough, unhurried attention she had applied to everything else across the long hours of the night. She did not leave. The team reached Wes and Amara knelt beside him, her hands moving to his neck to check his pulse before anything else, her eyes already running the visible assessment: skin color, breathing rate, the angle of the ankle that told her immediately and unambiguously what had happened there. He was cold to the touch, but his pulse was present, and his eyes were tracking her face with the slow but genuine focus of a man who was very tired and in significant pain and deeply relieved. "We've got you," she said quietly, her hand briefly on his shoulder. He nodded once. His voice came out rough and low, shaped by hours of cold air and stillness. "She stayed," he said. Amara glanced toward the lioness. She was still standing in the grass 12 meters off, watching the team work with her full attention. She watched them stabilize his leg with the field splint from the emergency kit. She watched them ease him onto the stretcher with the careful, coordinated movements of people who understood that speed and gentleness were not in opposition. She watched all of this without moving, without vocalizing, with only the slow movement of her ears to indicate that she was processing what she observed rather than simply waiting for it to be over. When the stretcher lifted and the team began moving back toward the vehicles, one of the younger rangers glanced back at her. She had taken 2 steps forward from where she had been standing, not toward the team, not in any direction that carried clear intent, simply forward, as though the distance had needed a small correction. They loaded Wes into the rear vehicle and the engine started, and Amara looked through the back window as they pulled onto the track. The lioness was standing at the base of the acacia. She watched the vehicles move away with the same composed, full-body attention she had maintained through everything. When the distance had grown to perhaps 80 meters, she turned slowly, with no particular urgency, and walked back into the scrub, and the tall grass received her without disturbance, parting and closing behind her as though she had never been there at all. The plain opened ahead of the vehicles in the full, quiet light of early morning, and no one spoke for a long time. And the radio crackled once with the base station asking for confirmation, and Amara pressed the transmit button and said only what needed to be said. Some of what had happened in the night between the acacia and the scrub belonged to no report that had yet been written. The ankle healed the way field injuries heal slowly, and with the particular stubbornness of a body that has been asked to do too much for too long and has decided to enforce its own timeline regardless of the schedule imposed upon it. 6 weeks passed between the morning the search team brought Wes back to the conservancy station and the morning he returned to active patrol. The other rangers were generous with him in the way that people are generous with someone who has been through something they cannot fully describe, offering practical help readily and asking questions carefully, giving him space when space was what the situation seemed to require. The station medic had been satisfied with the surgical repair and the subsequent recovery, and the conservancy director had signed the return-to-field clearance without ceremony, which was the way Wes had wanted it. He had not spoken extensively about the night under the acacia, not because he was unwilling, but because the available language kept failing to reach the thing it was trying to describe. He had written the incident report with precision and care: the fall, the injury, the wild dog presence, the whistle signals, the timeline of the search team's arrival. He had documented the presence of F7 as a coinciding observation, noting her proximity and the apparent deterrent effect of her positioning on the pack's approach. The language was accurate. It was also, he understood, deeply incomplete. But the gap between accurate and complete was not one he knew how to close with the vocabulary that field reports permitted, and so he had left it as it was and let the record stand for what it could hold. The northeastern boundary was his first assigned patrol on the day he returned. He did not request it. It appeared on the rotation naturally, the way assignments do in a team that has continued its work without interruption and has no particular reason to route one ranger away from a section of the Conservancy he had covered for nearly a decade. He noted it on the schedule the evening before with the quiet attention of someone filing information they intend to return to, and in the morning he drove out in the gray pre-dawn light the way he always had, with his water and his radio and his field notebook on the seat beside him and the familiar smell of the Mara in the dry season coming through the open window. He was running a slow survey loop along the eastern boundary track when he saw the movement near the watering hole. It was the quality of the movement that made him stop, not the fact of it, because movement near water in the early morning hours was unremarkable, but the particular weight and deliberateness of it, the way it displaced the light around it in a way that was distinct from the impala that had been drinking at the far edge of the hole moments before. He cut the engine and let the vehicle roll to a stop at a natural distance and sat without reaching for anything. Safi was at the water's edge. She was drinking in the long, unhurried pulls of an animal with no immediate concern, her muzzle lowered to the surface, her eyes half closed, her body carrying the loose, settled quality of an animal that owned this ground completely and knew it. The pale stripe on her left shoulder was vivid in the low morning light, that same faint luminosity that Wes had watched across the hours of the night 6 weeks before. Her coat was in good condition. Her frame looked well fed. Whatever the weeks since that night had contained for her, they had been adequate. Then he saw the cubs, 3 of them, pressed against her left flank in a shifting, unstable cluster, tumbling briefly over one another, separating, pressing back together with the urgent, uncoordinated insistence of very young animals, for whom proximity to the mother is the governing principle of all movement. They were perhaps 8 or 10 weeks old. Their spots were still the soft, faint markings of early cubhood, not yet the defined pattern that would sharpen as they grew, and their legs had the slightly too long, slightly uncertain quality of animals still negotiating the relationship between their bodies and the ground beneath them. One cub pressed its face toward the water's surface with the curiosity that young animals bring to everything, recoiled immediately at the cold, and pressed its face against Safi's foreleg instead. She did not look up from the water. Wes did not reach for his radio. He did not reach for the field notebook on the seat beside him, where the GPS coordinates and the estimated cub ages and the condition notes and the litter confirmation would normally already be taking shape in his handwriting. All of that would come later, in the quiet of the station, reconstructed from memory with the care and accuracy that 9 years of fieldwork had made habitual. He understood, in some way that did not require articulation, that reaching for the notebook now would be a small but complete misreading of what the moment was asking of him. He simply sat. Safi finished drinking and lifted her head. She turned and lowered herself onto her side in the short grass at the water's edge, with the heavy, deliberate movement of a large animal choosing rest, and the 3 cubs climbed onto her immediately with the total, uncomplicated trust of creatures for whom this body was the entire known world, warm, present, reliable, requiring no interpretation. She made a low sound in her chest as they settled, brief and quiet, and the smallest cub burrowed its head beneath her foreleg and was still. She had not looked toward the vehicle, but at some point in the stillness that followed in the long, warm quiet of the morning, with the water going flat and gold, as the sun cleared the horizon and the impala at the far edge of the hole, lifting their heads briefly before returning to drink, her right ear turned in the direction of the vehicle. It held there for 2 or 3 seconds. Then it rotated slowly back to neutral. Wes stayed with that for a long time. He did not try to name what had passed between that night and this morning, between the cold ground under the acacia and this warm grass at the water's edge. He had spent 6 weeks in the company of people who wanted to name it for him, who reached readily for the language of loyalty and gratitude and interspecies recognition, offering him their interpretations with the generous confidence of people who had not been there and therefore found it easier to be certain. He understood the impulse. He did not share it. What he had was simpler, and he thought more durable than any of those names. He had the memory of her breathing in the dark. He had the image of her ear turning toward his voice at 3 in the morning, and then turning back without drama toward the east. He had this moment now, 3 cubs in the grass, water going gold, her flank rising and falling in the early light with the slow, complete indifference of a wild animal fully inhabiting its own life. He started the vehicle eventually, with the same gentleness he had learned to apply to everything in this landscape. He pulled back onto the track and let the plain open ahead of him, the dry season grass bending in the first warm wind of the morning, a pair of crowned cranes lifting from the water's edge in a slow arc that crossed the sun and vanished. Behind him, at the watering hole, the cubs were still moving across her in their loose and stumbling orbits. The grass held the sound of the water. The morning continued, as mornings do, without asking anything of anyone. And Wes drove slowly home through all of it, carrying something that had no name and needed none.